Well, we've been working our way through the book of Matthew since the beginning of the year, and we are now at chapter 16. So if you have a Bible or your Bible app, or if not, it'll be up on the screens. But I love the fact that many of you have been reading along as we have been studying through Matthew, and I love the comments I get, that you have seen things, experienced things that I never saw, and I love that. I love that when God's revealing, teaching, tutoring you in the midst of your own reading. So Matthew chapter 16 deals with something I think is just foundationally important in our lives right now, the reality of fear and anxiety. Fear and anxiety. And Jesus is going to address this. So apparently fear and anxiety were a part of human existence 2,000 years ago. And guess what? It's still a part of human existence 2,000 years later. And I've been trying to read a lot on this whole realm of the growing waves of anxiety and fear that we're seeing, especially in our Western culture. And it's fairly confusing to sociologists because, you know, there were eras in human existence where you were like literally afraid of being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or facing famine that could, eliminate life of, packs of animals or marauding tribes. And in many ways, we would live in maybe the safest environment that human beings have ever seen. However, there have been these increasing levels of fear and anxiety in our world. And no one's quite sure why that is and what's going on. There are some that say, well, when you're not worried about saber-toothed tigers, you get worried about little things, okay? And I don't know. But here's a study. This is American Psychiatric Association. For the last several years, they've been asking this question: are you more anxious and afraid than you were last year? 2004, in their poll, 43% of U.S. adults reported feeling more anxious and fearful than the previous year. In 2023, 37% of people said they were more anxious and afraid than the previous year. 2022, 32% of people said they were more anxious and afraid than the previous year. And so that and many other studies would say we find ourselves more anxious and more afraid than we were last year. And that's just not a good trajectory, is it? So what is happening, and how do the followers of Jesus deal with the things in life that cause us anxiety and fear? There's a book that I'm just shocked. It was written 25 years ago. And I'm amazed at how the author, Edwin Friedman, who is a Jewish rabbi and a therapist, how he anticipated where America would be going. So 25 years ago, he wrote this. He said that Western society and American culture in specific is going to regress emotionally and relationally in the future. And he said, here's the stages that he would anticipate we would go through. So 25 years before this, he said, here's the 5 stages. First of all, we'd have increased reactivity. Okay, reactivity, where we would have these internal responses of fear and anxiety. And he predicted that things like 24-hour news cycles, which expose us to every horrible thing that could potentially happen around the globe, right? It would create this reactivity in our hearts, and we would then be more anxious and more fearful. And he said, so stage 1 is reactivity. He said stage 2 will be this. We'll move toward a herding instinct. Okay, so herds, like a herd of sheep. And so he said, once we become more reactive, what we'll do is we'll devolve into kind of mob mentalities, and we'll find people who are afraid of the same things we're afraid of, and we'll create these tight-knit communities, and we'll really notice the differences between our herds and other people's herds. And there will be a growing divide in American culture. Then he said stage 3 is blame displacement. And he describes that this way: we will focus more and more on the symptoms and not the actual problems. We'll be looking for someone else to be responsible, not ourselves. And we will assume that everything bad that happens is somebody else's responsibility, not our responsibility. Sound familiar? It says from then, we'll move into a quick fix mentality. Because of our anxiety and because of our blame displacement, we will look for the quickest possible fixes for physical ailments, for social problems, for even religious problems, that rather than do the hard work and determine what we need to change, we'll look for policies that bring about quick fixes to deep and significant problems. And then the last thing is, he said, Western culture will face a significant lack of leadership. And the lack of leadership will be because leaders do not differentiate, and they too are filled with anxiety, and they become part of the herd mentality, and they divide, and they experience or are impacted by the fear and anxiety of others, and we'll just have very little healthy leadership in our society. Okay, so he predicts these 5 things, which I think is pretty accurate to where we are. But then he gives a solution. So this is not a man who's a follower of Jesus, brilliant. But he says, here's what the world will need. It will need a non-anxious presence to drop into the middle of the fear and anxiety and not experience the same fear and anxiety as culture is experiencing. And that non-anxious presence will impact the world in a profound way. And as I read this, I wonder this. Could it be that part of God's plan for the followers of Jesus is that he's designed us and asked us to be the non-anxious presence in the midst of an anxiety-riddled world? To be the people of peace who are not impacted by all the chaos around us, but have a different perspective and a different mentality. And man, as I'm looking, I know some of us are in the midst of trying to figure out what we believe, but as I'm looking at the followers of Jesus, I really believe that's his desire. Is that you are the non-anxious presence in the midst of your family of origin, where people are getting all worked up about everything imaginable and creating separation and herding mentalities and separate mobs, that you, as a follower of Jesus, you're the non-anxious presence in your workplace and your neighborhood because you're not impacted by the chaos, because your life is about something different. So I'd love for us to turn to Matthew chapter 16, which I think provides a beautiful template for our way forward. For the followers of Jesus to be non-anxious in the midst of storms. I'll read through this and I'm going to make some comments because I think some of the context will help us understand what's happening here. Matthew chapter 16, Jesus had just been teaching very, very large crowds, and the day has come to an end. It's getting close to dusk. And this is what we read. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. We're going to pause right there. Jesus is not the type of person who often made people do things. He often asked people to do things, asked them to stretch themselves. But this is interesting because Matthew says Jesus forced us. Okay? Remember, Matthew was one of the people. Jesus forced us to get into the boat, meaning they had some sort of objection. Many of them were fishermen. Maybe they were looking at the sky. Maybe they thought, hey, this is not a good night to be on the boat. But Jesus made us get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. This is to the other side of the Lake of Galilee, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, Jesus, went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Now, you will notice this at different times throughout Jesus' life, that he will seek alone time where he prays. Sometimes it's in the morning, sometimes it's at night, sometimes it's all night long. But Jesus just knew that vital to his relationship with his Father was this time where he would just, I'm focused on you. He's been with crowds, he's been giving, and then there's something about his own spiritual health, maybe recharging, where he's alone with the Father. Later that night, he was there alone, still praying, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land. So Lake of Galilee is 13 miles long. It's kind of shaped like a pear. It's 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide on average. And so Jesus has been praying for a long period of time, and the boat has gone a little ways, but not very far. And it's buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. There are times in life where the wind is behind us, and you just feel like everything is going exactly how you want it to go. And there are times when there's a headwind. And there's a headwind. One of the things I've been trying to do is ride my mountain bike north to south across the state of Montana. I do a couple hundred miles every summer. And this past year, I had a headwind that was blowing about 40 miles per hour. And I was looking, and I thought, I think I'm going 3 miles per hour. And I was really working hard, right? I am making no progress whatsoever. When the wind's in your face, there's this sense of futility and frustration because you may give more effort, but that effort doesn't reward you with more distance, okay? That's exactly what they're facing. Next slide, please. Shortly before dawn. So Romans divided the nighttime into 4 3-hour watches. It began at 6 p.m. and went to 6 a.m. And in Greek, if you look at a Greek translation, it says during the 4th watch. So the first watch was 6 to 9, second watch was 9 to 12, 12 to 3, 3 to 6. And so this is actually the 4th watch. So here's what this means. They've been rowing for a minimum of 9 hours to go 8 miles across the lake. And they haven't gone very far. All right, this has been a long, long night. Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. They were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. So here's a little bit about what's happening behind the scenes. So Hebrew culture had a couple of things that made this really, really terrifying for them. So first is they just were not a sea people. So the Hebrew people had always been nomads in the middle of a land. In fact, their enemies were always the sea people. So people like the Philistines who occupied, colonized the coast. And for Hebrew people, the sea was a place of chaos. It was a place where, if you read the Old Testament, there's this terrifying creature known as the Leviathan that lives there. And in first century Jewish culture, here's what they believed, many of them believed, that anyone who was the victim of a drowning is that it was likely or possible that their spirits would remain and their spirits would walk at night on the water, okay? And here's the word they use, phantasma. That's the word. It's a ghost, a phantasma. Similar to Fantasia, the weirdest Disney movie of all time, right? I remember watching that as a kid, just let down. Like, what was that about, right? So they literally think this is the spirit of someone who had drowned, and the spirit's walking towards them. But Jesus immediately said to them 3 things. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, if you're not a phantasma, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. And I have a sense that Peter regretted asking that question because Jesus goes, come. Come, he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. If there's one thing you remember from Matthew chapter 16, remember this phrase. When you're in a storm and you're ready to step out of the boat, where do you walk? You walk toward Jesus. Here's our natural tendency. Try to walk away from the storm, right? How do I get away from this storm, this difficulty, this pain, this chaos? In the middle of a storm, here's what a follower of Jesus does, is you step out of the boat and you walk toward Jesus. Our lives are not about how do I ease the pain, how do I make this as easy as possible. They're about, can I walk toward Jesus when the boat is creaking and the waves are crashing? Walk toward Jesus. But when he, meaning Peter, saw the wind, so you can't see the wind, but you see what the wind does, right? It's spray of water, waves crashing. When he saw the wind, he was afraid. Here comes the fear. And beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him. This is, we'll talk about this in a moment, but this is pivotal in Matthew's whole book, his narrative. This is the big phrase. This is where everything turns. They worship him saying, truly you are the Son of God. Profound. I wanted you to say two things. Number one, if you want to be the non-anxious presence and a person of peace, and a person who's not afraid, basically it's this, right? There's 11 phenomenal human beings in this boat. And they're terrified. They're terrified. And there's one who says, I'm scared to death, but I'm willing to walk toward Jesus in the storm, right? And Peter gets knocked for this one all the time. But like I ask myself, okay, ask yourself, in all honesty, would you be one of the 11 who stayed in the boat or the one person who climbed out and tried to walk on water? I'd be the 11, man, piled up into a huddle. Like, no, that's crazy. He is a ghost, right? It's the storm. People don't walk on water. I've got all kinds of rationale for staying in the boat. But I want to be. I want you to be. I want us to be the people who step out of the boat. So point number one is this. This story is about understanding who Jesus is. It's not an instruction on how to walk on water, okay? It is a story to reveal who Jesus is. Now, here's what Matthew has done, and it's really easy to miss this, but he has divided his book into 3 sections. Chapters 1 through 3 have all been about this. Jesus is a king, and he places Jesus into the midst of 2 other kings that exist. There's Caesar Augustus, who is king and emperor of the Roman world, and there's this character named Herod, and through the birth narrative, through these gifts that come from Magi, we are told that Jesus is a new king. Herod feels threatened because these wise men from the east come and say, hey, we saw that there is a new king who is born. So chapters 1 through 3, Matthew wants us to understand that Jesus is bringing a kingdom. It's not a kingdom like Rome's empire, but it is a kingdom that establishes something brand new and dynamic on planet Earth. So that's chapter 1 through 3. In chapters 4 through 13, this is what Matthew has been teaching, that Jesus is a prophet. Like all of the Old Testament prophets, he is teaching and he's bringing revelation of who God is, who humanity is, what the relationship between God and humans can be like. And he's been doing these miracles that only the Old Testament prophets have been able to do. And they're like, he is indeed a prophet. Chapter 14 through the end of the book, Matthew is going to help us to understand this. Jesus is divine. He is God. Now, in this book, you have 12 people. This is 2.5 years into following Jesus. They have heard Jesus teach how many times? They've heard him say extraordinary things that none of the other Jewish rabbis have said. They have seen Jesus do miraculous things that doctors can't explain. They've seen Jesus take a little bit of bread and a few fish and feed this huge crowd. They've seen Jesus restore people who had no hope. They've seen these extraordinary things, and they're still convinced that Jesus is just a prophet. Just a prophet. It's in a storm where you really begin to understand who Jesus is. Up to this point, the only people in the book of Matthew who have said that Jesus was God were demons. Jesus would encounter somebody who was dealing with some demonic influence in their life, and a couple of times this happens. The demons run up and say, Jesus, we know who you are. You are the Son of God. And what does Jesus say to him every time? Shh. Don't tell anybody that. It's not yet time. And it's not because Jesus was trying to hide that. Jesus just knew this. The minute that people began to consider that Jesus was God, the clock started ticking. Because the religious institution of Pharisees and Sadducees would have to eliminate him. And so Jesus waits till this point, 2.5 years into this 3-year journey with his disciples. And he says, I'm going to force you to get into a boat and head into a storm. Because it's time to move from being an admirer to a worshiper. Here's what they'd done. They greatly admired Jesus. Ladies and gentlemen, I would just say in our North American society that has just Christianity kind of interwoven into the fabric of who we are, I think it's very easy to stay in a place where you're an admirer and a respecter of Jesus. Right? There aren't many people in the world today who are like, Jesus, who? Right? There's legend, there's influence, there's familiarity with a few Bible stories, but it's really easy to stay where the disciples were. And you stay in this point of familiarity. I respect him, I follow him, I listen to him. He's a great ethical teacher. He's an example for me. I listen to his words. But there is a movement that needs to happen beyond that. And it's moving from being an admirer to being a worshiper. Because when you worship, you are declaring that Jesus is God. And the disciples, for the first time, say, truly, this is the Son of God. And what convinced them? It wasn't Jesus feeding thousands of people. It wasn't Jesus healing broken bodies. It wasn't Jesus teaching these profound things. It was that Jesus was walking on water. And their buddy Peter, who's always like, yeah, I'll try that. He picks him up as he begins to sink. And then when Jesus steps into the boat, what happens? The wind dies. So there's Old Testament precedents for this. This is part of what the disciples must have been thinking about. They're so familiar with the Old Testament. God who oversees the natural realm. As they see Jesus do this, they begin to understand, oh, this is not a man. This is not a rabbi. This is not a teacher. This is something more. Job chapter 9, verse 8. We read this. He alone. So, by the way, the book of Job is a story about one monster storm, okay? There's this guy. His name's not Job. It's Job. And this guy, goes through it. He loses everything. His wealth, his family, his kids. The only thing he's left with is a wife who he doesn't like. And she doesn't like him. The whole book, and a bunch of friends who are kind of friends. And he loses everything. And this is what Job chapter 9 says. He alone, meaning God, stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. It's God who does that. Psalm 107, excuse me. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. So here you have 12 men in a boat, fighting futility, fighting chaos, afraid for their lives, getting nowhere. And Jesus steps into the boat, and it's a moment of revelation for them. They worship. He's not just a man. He's not just a prophet. He's not just a model. He is indeed God. And no one has acknowledged that except for demons up to this point in the book of Matthew. Here's what I would say. I think for each and every one of us, part of the challenge of storms is in a storm, you wonder, does God love me? Why did he send me into this? Anybody have one of those? Like, man, life is crazy. God, you told me to do this, and now my life's awful. Do you think any of them were mumbling under their breath about how frustrated they were with Jesus during the 9 hours of trying to row? Like, what in the world? Where's he at? He's like, up there, Jesus, up there praying while we're rowing. Why does he always have to pray, right? I would have been there. But it's in a storm that I experience the presence of God, and I move from being an admirer to a worshiper. That Jesus is actually Lord and he is divine. It's funny how God so often gives you a chance to put these things into practice, right? So I've been thinking about this for a couple of weeks, studying this passage. A week ago, I was in Los Angeles leading some meetings, and I got a call on Wednesday during my meeting, and it was from one of my daughter-in-laws, and she said this. She said, "Your son is alive." Like, that's not what I wanted to hear. However, one of our sons had a training accident. He's in the military, and had fallen and had to be flown by helicopter to a hospital in Las Vegas, a trauma center, and they were deeply concerned. He's going to be fine. He's got multiple broken bones and hands and stitches and broken foot and broken toes. But it was really touch and go. He was unconscious for a very long period of time. And I'm like at a meeting in Los Angeles, and I can't do anything, and you're feeling anxious, and I've got to like lead the rest of this meeting. And just a couple days later, I get a call from my mom. "Hey, your dad is really, really sick. We're taking him into the ER. Get a call back. Hey, your dad has a tumor. They're going to do surgery immediately." And man, like, you just kind of like, Lord, like, not cool, right? I just don't need this storm right now. I do not need the storm. And by the way, I learned to pray a hedge of protection around my family, and the hedge isn't working. By the way, I've always wondered, so those of you who haven't been in church, it's a really weird Christian phrase. We pray a hedge of protection. I've always thought, why a hedge? Like, how about a stone wall or something? Like, hedges seem fairly permeable. And I'm in my meetings, I'm like, God, this is not, what is happening, right? And here it comes. Anxiety, fear, what could happen? And I have to ask myself, Lord, could you make me the non-anxious presence in this storm? And here's why I'm not going to be afraid. Because Jesus is God. And he may have sent my family into a storm, but he's walking on the water toward us. And I want to walk towards him, because what I want to do is I want to avoid storms. I want to paddle away from them. I want the path of least resistance and least pain possible. But instead, what if we stepped out of the boat of fear and walked toward Jesus and experienced worship in the midst of the storm? Not the anger, not the frustration, not the fear, not the anxiety, but experience worship in the storm. Point number 2 is very simple. I do not need to be afraid. You do not need to be afraid. We do not need to be afraid. Part of what Matthew is saying is if Jesus is truly God, it means in the storm of life you are not alone. It means that God walking on the storm, the potential, because it's not just a prophet who's walking on water. It is God who created the heavens and the earth, who created the systems that are around us. And when Jesus steps in that boat, the wind dies down. It means that he is bigger than whatever crisis we face, whatever cultural issue, whatever political, whatever geopolitical, whatever like societal, whatever marriage issue, whatever family chaos, whatever health issue that we face. If Jesus is in the storm, we're gonna be okay. And so what does Jesus say to them? It is I. Oh, take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. By the way, the it is I, in the Greek language, Matthew captures something really unique. So it is I in Greek is ego eimi. And ego eimi is the Greek phrase for the divine name of God, captured in Exodus chapter 3. You have Moses, and there's a burning bush, and Moses is being told to go back to Egypt and set his people free. And God says, Moses says, who are you? And he says, I am Yahweh, which in Hebrew means I am. Jesus uses the Greek equivalent to that as he's walking there afraid, like it's a ghost, it's a phantasma. And Jesus says, I am. It is this name that is so sacred and beautiful. And here's what Jesus is still saying to people caught in storms and the turmoil of life. Take courage. In your boat that seems to be creaking and cracking and falling apart. It is I. Do not be afraid. And it's not that I have some deep internal response where I'm like, okay, I'm going to be courageous. The courage comes from this. It's Jesus. And I'm not alone in the storm. And when Jesus walks towards my chaotic boat, it means all the potential for health and restoration and healing and calm is there. It means that I have somebody to worship in the midst of the chaos. Do not be afraid. Who do I listen to? Do I listen to the waves and the roar of the wind, or do I listen to Jesus' voice? Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. So we have Peter, the non-anxious, at least for a period of time, presence, steps out of the boat. And he does like nobody else does it. I mean, I saw David Copperfield do it, but I think it was an illusion. He walks on the water, and then he begins to sink. When do you begin to sink? Do you begin to sink and then you have fear? Or do you have fear and then you begin to sink? He sees the storm, right? So he had been looking at Jesus. Jesus said, come to me. And suddenly his eyes come off of Jesus and he's like blown away that Jesus is bigger than the storm. And then he sees, Matthew says he saw the wind. And like the minute he sees the wind, what? Fear happens. Fear happens, I begin to sink. And Jesus says, oh, let me get you. Here's what I want. I want to be a person who steps out of the boat, the chaos-filled boat of fear that my culture lives in. And I want to say, man, in a storm, I walk towards Jesus, and my faith is here, and it's there, and sometimes I'm afraid, but this is what I know. Jesus is consistent, and the minute that my fear leads to sinking, Jesus is going to grab me and say, come on up. Let me get on the boat, and let me bring peace. Let my followers be the non-anxious presence in the midst of the fear. Will you pray with me? Lord, I know, we all know that there is plenty of anxiety and fear. There are storms. We're experiencing different types of storms right now in our lives. There's financial storms and health crisis and cultural things. There is so much that we could be afraid of and so much that we could be anxious about. I pray that the followers of Jesus would be the non-anxious presence, and we would step out of the boat of fear. And we would walk towards Jesus in the midst of the storm. And Lord, every storm that we face would be an opportunity to worship. It would be an opportunity to move one step farther from just being an admirer of Jesus to understanding that you are worthy of worship. And even if you send us into storms, we understand that there is a purpose for that. There is a developmental thing that can happen in the midst of the storm where we come out knowing you as the Son of God. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Hey, thanks so much for walking through that. A couple of thoughts. If you're a guest, thank you for coming. It takes so much courage. We have a gift for you at the Welcome Center. If you need a Bible, there's free Bibles there at the Welcome Center. If you need anything in terms of prayer, there's people up front you can trust. They'd love to pray for you, talk to you about who Jesus is. As you go, be the hands and feet, mouthpiece of Jesus. God bless you. You're loved.